Welcome to Clubhouse with a review of the Bandai entry Nipper, which is Bandai's officially branded side cutters that Bandai themselves never sold in nearly 40 years since they've been making Gundam models. This is the budget model side cutters, as the slightly awkward English here tells us, and Bandai also sells the build-up Nipper, which is slightly more expensive. The ones we have here were released on March 22nd, 2019, and they sold for a price of 702 yen, and no, that isn't a typo. The release price really was like that. The ones right here are blue, and the cutters released with two other colors initially. There was also a red one, and also this white one, which is really popular judging from how often I see it in photos online. 2 years later, in March 2021, Bandai added these nice pink ones as well, and along with that one, they also added this really serious looking gray one for a total of 5 colors as of this video. The front of the package here has the Gundam here and everything, and a lot of people like to call these the Gundam Nippers, but the package actually doesn't have the word Gundam on it at all, and Bandai probably doesn't want to pigeonhole this thing, right after they did exactly that with the Gundam picture. On the bottom here it says that this is made in Taiwan, and this is our first hint that we should snoop around. And on the back, sure enough, Bandai tells us in really tiny text that this is manufactured by Mineshima. Specifically, this is actually the Mineshima baby cutter. It's exactly the same product but repackaged, and the Mineshima cutter is actually carried by a lot of stores precisely as a low price cutter. So if you ever see that one at a better price, you can just buy the Mineshima one instead. The build-up Nippers are also from Mineshima, or so I've read online. I think that's almost certainly true, but I don't have one of those, so I can't confirm for you right here. Anyway, it's not a big conspiracy thing, and it's just a nice thing to know that you can save a bit of money if you ever see one or the other at a lower price. For documentation's sakes, here's a bit at the top that teaches you how to use these cutters, and here's a bit at the bottom with all the customer service info and such. Now, before I bully the hell out of these cutters, let me first say that these cutters are actually fine as a tool, as long as you know what these cutters can and can't do. They're not utter trash or anything, but they do have some very important caveats to them that you have to get around. Okay, so there are 3 major issues with these: control, accuracy, and sharpness. First off, for control, Mineshima calls these baby cutters not because they're for noobs or babies or anything like that, but they mean that it's small, and at first glance they really do look small, don't they? If we bring in the legendary workhorse, the Tamiya sharp-pointed side cutters, it makes the Bandai one look small indeed, and modelers have blamed the entry Nippers for being small and hard to hold, but that's not entirely accurate. If we put the handles side by side, the grips are actually about the same length, so in terms of holding the cutters, they're actually no different than the Tamiya, which modelers swear by. And yet it's true that the entry Nipper doesn't feel as nice to handle. With these, you feel less confident and far less in control. The actual culprit is not the grip, but everything above it. The handles on the Tamiya extend past the grip, and the hinge is way higher before we get to the blade. On the entry Nipper, the hinge comes right after the handle, and then it's already the blades. It doesn't look like a big deal, but in your hands, that missing bit of reach makes these much more clumsy to handle. It's of course not impossible to work with, and if these really are your first cutters, then they'll be fine and you'll never know the difference. But that's why if you've used other cutters with that extra reach, you really will notice the difference. This is a trade-off to keep the tool as affordable as it can, though sadly it isn't something that makes the tool better for beginners. And the second issue is accuracy. We can see this if we study the blades a little bit. So you notice the gleam of the blade right here as it catches the light? That's one side of the blade not sitting flat with the other side, so there's a bit of an underbite here. My Tamiya cutters may be really worn from close to a decade of use, but check out how that same gleam won't show up at the side of the blades, and they line up accurately even after 10 years and going through basically every kit you've seen on this channel and a ton more. It looks like a small thing, but this becomes a big obstacle when you use these. So if we do the proper 2-cut on a gate like this, you'll often get some of the gate left like this, and no matter how many times you go back over it with the blade, you won't make a difference because the blade just can't sit flush with the surface. With the right orientation, you can get clean cuts like this one right here, but that's only when the location of the gate and the orientation of the parts allow it. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do if this is the only tool you have at hand, and as a tool for beginners, that may very well be the case. But you might say, well, that's not a problem, right? You can use the blade like a knife and scrape the gate to trim it down. That has to work, right? Well, unfortunately, that's where the final major issue comes up, the sharpness. At a glance, the cutters look sharp, and they feel sharp if you run your fingers along it, but no, don't actually go and do it. But it's not sharp enough. So let's see a comparison here by cutting through the bar on this runner here as a test, and as a reminder, don't do this with your cutters because it can damage the blades if you force it through really thick material. This is purely for educational purposes. Side by side, we can see how the entry nipper chewed up that cut, whereas the Tamiya cut is much more uniform in how it starts and how it finishes at the center. We get this left one right here because it's a dull blade. The entry nippers are basically using its hardness to force its way through the material and basically ripping it apart by pinching it really tightly. The first issue here is that our cuts are always going to be a little bit uneven and a little bit unclean like this, unless you're really lucky occasionally. But also, you can't use these cutters to scrape the parts like this. The blades just don't have the edge to take off that bit of gate here, and it just basically does nothing. So we can't scrape our parts with the entry nipper, and more experienced builders tend not to need to do this in the first place because they have other tools. But again, we are looking at a situation where many beginners will have this as their first tool at hand, and losing that option to scrape a gate is just not very ideal. Okay, so things look pretty bad for the entry nipper, right? But it's not the end of the world, and there is a simple solution. The entry nipper sadly can't be your one and only tool. On its own, it simply can't get the job done at a level that I'd say is acceptable. So along with these cutters, you must also have a knife, and go watch my video on picking the best hobby knife. It's a really important video for any builder. The weakness of these cutters is that the actual cut will never be very clean and very accurate, but when you have a knife, that's what handles the cleanliness and the accuracy, so all the problems here are addressed. Well, now you might also say, what the hell kind of a solution is that when I have to buy a second tool to fix the first tool? Yeah, it's not very ideal, but it's just a reality that the entry-level tool just doesn't have much more for us to work with, no matter how clever we get with it. With all that said, here's a Hobby Clubhouse 3-point verdict on the Bandai Spirits entry nipper. Number 1, it's a bad tool for beginners. Let's get the big condemnation out of the way right up front. I do not recommend these cutters for beginner model fans, and I think they're really harmful in some ways. When a new model fan uses these and gets really messy cuts, what's he or she gonna think? Well, oh no, I must not be very good at this yet. And then, gee, this is really messy and it's not really nice and I don't like this. Now, they're gonna try and get better when in fact the tool itself has a really low ceiling to what you can do with it. It's important for all modelers to know that this is okay as a basic cutting tool, but you can't learn and get better with it, and I think that's a huge problem. It's much less bad if you've watched this video and you know what's going on, so make sure to tell your friends about these cutters so they know what its limits are really early on. And number 2, it's a low price at a high cost. Almost every problem of the entry nipper stems from cost cutting. They save material by making it shorter, and they save machining time and machining costs by making blades that aren't entirely aligned, and they did the same thing with blades that are less sharp. This all comes to a very low entry price point, which I have to admit is lower than almost anything else you can find from reputable makers. No other company makes cutters at below 1,000 yen. But as we've covered in the previous point, it's no good if we get new fans into the hobby, but then they're trapped by invisible walls that are set up by all that cost cutting. So despite it being affordable, I don't think it's a good deal for any modelers, new or old. And number 3, these weak cutters can be strange teachers. I will preach my core belief that the cutter is not the central tool to nice builds and forming good habits. The knife is where you can really build up your eye for detail and good control over how you remove and change materials on a model kit. The God hands never came up in this review because they get the job done just a little bit too well, and they leave very little room for early builders to learn. If you have one of these entry nippers, rather than ditching them immediately for something more reliable like the Tamiya ones, it's also good to explore using a knife until you grow really familiar with that knife instead. Then, when you switch to better cutters, after working with the knife enough, you'll really appreciate every ounce of improvement the better cutters offer, and they'll feed right into your skills with using a knife. That's what I think anyway, but don't get these cutters just to force yourself to learn. That's not what I mean here. No, this isn't Dragon Ball. It's just that these cutters can still have a place in your toolset and there's no need to throw them away or anything. So that's a review for the Bandai Spirits entry nippers. Some people say this isn't a very good tool and they're right, and some people say they use it and it's fine and they're also right. Hopefully this review has helped clear up why both things are true at the same time for this strange little tool. Thank you so much for watching. Come look us up on social media with updates on upcoming videos and sneak peeks at future projects. Links are in the description below. Or hang out here some more with one of these other videos. But before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified of new videos from Hobby Clubhouse, and I'll see you next time.